Welcome to the NEJM Group Open Forum on Medstro. It's a 6-part, 6-week series on doing medicine while doing science. And it's being done in collaboration with APSA, the American Physician Scientists Association, and the NEJM Group CareerCenter, about which let's hear something from Cathy.
Hi everyone. Just a couple of quick words. On behalf of the NEJM Career Center, we are pleased to welcome APSA into the NEJM Career Center Conversations on Medstro. Together we've curated 6 great topics surrounding physician scientist careers, and we're certain these will generate some interesting and very informative discussions. Back to you, Joe.
Thanks, Cathy. The online discussion began just about 2 hours ago, and we invite your participation. Over the next 6 weeks, ask your questions of our panel of experts and featured guests. The questions will be moderated chiefly by Alex Adami, an MD PhD student at the University of Connecticut and president-elect of APSA. Joining him are Dan DelloStritto, another MD PhD candidate from Northeast Ohio Medical University, who is also, I should add, the president of APSA. Stephanie Brosius, also pursuing an MD PhD at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. Now, among the experts, that is, people who are putting these much pursued degrees to work, are Payne, an associate professor of dermatology and associate director of the Medical Scientist Training Program at the University of Pennsylvania, and Frank David, the founder of Pharmagellan. Welcome, everybody. I hope I haven't left anyone out. If I have, you'll wave your hands. Dan, Mr. President, I want to ask you first, why should people join APSA, and what are the advantages you see as a current student pursuing these degrees?
Well, thank you, Joe. I want to thank you, the NEJM and the NEJM Career Center for this opportunity for this partnering, and Medstro as well, to put on the 6-week discussion. So with APSA, we are the preeminent student organization for physician scientist trainees, not just MD PhD students, but those in medical school interested in career as physician scientists. And we provide advocacy and information tools, as well as networking opportunities that's really unfounded at any other organization. We have access to the American Society of Clinical Investigation and the Academy of American Physicians, 2 preeminent physician scientists organizations, and this allows us to have a collective from all the way from the trainees all the way to the old guys, as they call themselves, and yeah, and it's just a great opportunity for students to begin involved at such an early stage.
And so is that involvement a lot of mentoring, for instance? Is that one of the things that you try to do?
So yeah, so we have a lot of different initiatives, from being a mentee as well as being a mentor. So you get that experience from the beginning. We have new initiatives this year where mentoring undergraduate students to help them inform them about what the life of a MD PhD student is like. But we also have the opportunities and have expanded our mentoring relationships with the ASCI and AAP to where you can reach out to them on a personal level, excuse me, and make those connections at an early stage in your career.
Aimee Payne, you direct a medical student, medical scientist training program at a medical school. Is there a certain type of student who comes through the combined MD PhD program? Are these people, for instance, likely to love the sound of breaking test tubes, or are there no personality types in particular?
That's funny. I personally hate the sound of breaking test tubes. Hopefully our students don't hear too much of that either. But, you know, I think that it's a diverse group of people. Specifically, I guess here on this panel, we have a lot of MD, PhD people represented, but Daniel raises a really good point, which is that if we think about physician scientist training in the United States, it comes from a diverse range of people. So we have people that are doing straight medical school first and then decide to pursue science later, either through a PhD or a postdoctoral fellowship. Some people rarely do the PhD first and then decide to go to medical school afterwards. And then, of course, there is what I'm most familiar with, which is MD, PhD combined training. And I think that that training pathway really suits people who come upon research relatively early in their undergraduate career, really learn to love it, and basically want to combine research and clinical training, which I think is particularly synergistic.
So who, for instance, may have had a summer job in a hospital lab or something and just all of a sudden fall in love with that as but also since they're going there's a kind of connection also with people, isn't there? I mean, you can do science, and then you have to go upstairs and manage somebody's diabetes.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, many of us actually split our clinical duties. So, for example, I am a dermatologist. My specialty is in autoimmune blistering diseases. They're rare diseases. And so I practice 1/2 day a week, seeing patients with pemphigus and pemphigoid, which are the two most common diseases that we see. And then in the laboratory, I study B-cell repertoires in patients with pemphigus. So it's very synergistic. I'm able to see the patients, draw blood, understand the disease, also understand maybe the limitations of current therapy and where we can best intervene. And then bring it back to the lab and study it. So it really brings a lot of relevance to the work that we do in the laboratory. And for me, I find that it works very well.
Alex, Adami, what led you to pursue this path? And what are you learning from? I guess you've started your patient encounters. So what are you learning from that you're not learning from, say, tissue cultures?
So I haven't gone back to the 3rd year yet. I have 1 more year of PhD to go.
Okay.
But interestingly, I was talking about this with directors of MD PhD programs at a recent meeting. I hated lab classes in college. I thought they were a waste of time. But then I did 2 summers of research, and I loved it and got hooked and couldn't see myself doing anything else other than putting that together with medical school. So it was very interesting how I've gotten to where I am based on how much I hated doing every lab class I ever took in college.
Well, I remember a microbiology seminar that I was in. It was a 4-hour lab, and the guy spent 4 hours lecturing what he wanted us to do in the lab. And so that was it for sleeping for that week. So what are your interests, Alex?
So I study the microbiome, the communities of microorganisms that live on and inside of you, and how they affect asthma. So I'm interested in trying to figure out how we can potentially influence the microbiome and change the way we treat asthma, because it's currently a disease that we aren't very good at taking care of, and we certainly can't cure. Yeah. So this is where a physician scientist can look at the problem and say, yes, we have all these drugs we can use for it, but we're not anywhere near a solution. So it's my job to really go in and figure out how to cure it and stop just trying to put a bandage on the wound, so to speak.
Frank David, you're in a different sector, aren't you? As I understand it, you help develop biomedical entrepreneurs. Can you tell us a bit about that and the challenges that you face?
Sure. So, yeah, I spend most of my time, excuse me, running a biomedical consulting firm that I started about 2 years ago. So, unlike many of the other people here, I don't see patients, I don't touch patients, I don't touch test tubes, but I think about all those things all the time, and that was actually really the appeal for me. Is I realized sort of toward my early faculty position after my postdoc that I was less interested in actually doing science or doing clinical medicine and a little bit more interested in understanding how those pieces fit together in the drug development process. So I spend most of my time actually advising clinical stage biotechs on everything from how to get things from the bench into the clinic, what those late preclinical studies should look like, what the clinical studies actually should look like at the early stages, and then also doing some of the business work associated with that, whether it's the financial modeling or business development support. So really a much more, I would say much more of a quote-unquote engineering kind of focus, in the sense that not as engineering a discipline, but more using the tools to actually help create drugs rather than creating data.
Now, you've got an MD, PhD. Do you also have an MBA?
I don't. I got my MBA basically on the job. I spent 5 years working at another management consulting firm called Lyric Partners, where essentially it was basically my second residency. I had originally trained in pathology. I would say that that second residency was pretty much just as painful as my first one.
And I guess you don't want to betray any business confidences, but can you give us an example of something that you've shepherded through? Can you speak freely about any?
So we have a client right now that we're working with that has a, when I started working with them, they had a molecule that had been parked in their earlier development because they couldn't really figure out what to do with it, and they didn't have enough resources to move it forward. It's actually something that would be useful in breast cancer. Really, when I came in, it was a 40-person company. 39 of the people in the company were focused on the lead asset, which was in a totally different indication, and they needed someone to help them figure out, is there value to us advancing this breast cancer asset, and if there is, what should we do about it? So I've been working with them, and my team actually has been working with them for about 2 years, starting with understanding what that opportunity looks like. Can we do something that's really differentiated in breast cancer? Do we think that we are offering something that's different from what's already out there and what's in development? So some of the strategic pieces. Then we worked with them to set up some clinical collaborations to get into the clinic. So interacting with physicians to understand what those studies should look like and what would be exciting. As you may gather, in breast cancer, there's a lot of different opportunities to develop a drug, and there are some choices that need to be made. Monotherapy, combination therapy, combined with which agents, which types of patients, which lines of therapy, et cetera. And more recently, we've actually both been helping them to design those phase 1 trials, while also helping to backfill a little on the preclinical side and helping to shepherd through some preclinical experiments. This is a company that doesn't manage its own lab, so all of the research is outsourced. So we've been helping to design the preclinical experiments to figure out a little bit better what the mechanism of action is, and create kind of a differentiated story about why we're different from other molecules in the class, and then also helping to just do the hands-on execution in terms of designing the experiments with the CROs and managing them.
Yeah, so it sounds like a rather complicated day.
It's pretty complex, but pretty fun.
Good. I wanted to ask Dan. Dan, your annual meeting just took place in April, is that right?
That is correct.
And so were there any highlights of that meeting that you could share?
Absolutely. So our annual meetings in conjunction with the 2 societies I previously mentioned, ASCI and AAP. This year we had a collection of keynote speakers and panelists that were preeminent. So we had Craig Thompson, the CEO of Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. He came and gave a very interesting and captivating talk. Then we had Alfred Sommer, the Lasker winner and discovery of vitamin A and its treatment for ophthalmic disorders. He came and also gave a talk. It's a great opportunity at the annual meeting to really put really match up those mentor-mentee relationships that we were previously talking about, and this is where all that magic happens. It is our event of the year, so to say.
Yeah. And how many members has APSA got?
So APSA has about 1,400 members, and about 400 or so attend the annual meeting each year.
So it's a big networking meeting.
Absolutely. So there's 400 APSA members, and then there's about 1,000 or so ASCI or AAP members. So it's a pretty it's a smaller meeting, but at the same time, these are people that are at the top of the academic stratosphere.
There was I guess there's an award, the Lasker Award. That's I believe is it the Lasker Award?
So there is an award that the Lasker Foundation gives out each year, and we've partnered with the Lasker Foundation to have a Lasker keynote speaker, and that this year was Alfred Summer, as I previously mentioned, and that's one of our key attractants. Each year we have big speakers. So a couple of years ago we had Nobel laureates. So we have anywhere from Nobel laureates to Lasker speakers. These are the people that are really pushing ahead for the physician scientist community.
On YouTube, there are several videos of some of those speeches. I was watching them yesterday, and they're very interesting.
Yeah. So there's the ones from this year, and then there's also ones from last year. We just started to record them. So one of the other individuals we had on there was Mary Klopman from Duke, talking about her work in infectious disease, and it's some amazing work that she does, and also for as busy as she is, and her and her husband both run 2 preeminent hospitals, and that just shows you, what you can do not only as a physician scientist, but a physician scientist couple.
Yeah. I want to ask the group. I've been reading a little bit about the 21st Century Cures Act and the kind of, there's a sort of opposition to it from people who fear that the drug and equipment manufacturers are going to have too much leeway that is outside of the FDA in developing new products for the marketplace. Is that a part of the buzz among your colleagues? Anyone?
Well, I mean, I think on the biotech and pharma side, certainly there's always this inevitable push-pull between, safety and access. And I think that it really depends in many ways on which constituency you're talking to and also what diseases you're talking about. I mean, I think FDA in general has been appropriately focused on, proportionally more focused on safety for less life-threatening conditions that affect larger numbers of people, and has, I think appropriately, and I think most of the companies that I work with would agree, has appropriately backed off on some of those stringent requirements for diseases that are much more life-threatening and or affect much smaller numbers of people. And honestly, there's what's fascinating in this area. One of the things that's fascinating in this area is that there's somewhat of a disconnect between patients and patient advocacy groups who many of times, especially in those smaller disease indications where there are much more significant impact on health, they are really clamoring for better access, faster access to drugs, devices, et cetera. And yet at the same time, I think from the academic community, there's a lot more caution being urged. And I think a lot of that, again, comes from people who come from a perspective of looking at cardiovascular drugs, for example, or cardiovascular devices, which are used in hundreds of thousands, millions of patients, where the bar should be higher. So I think that's the tension. I think most early stage biotechs take a wait and see attitude towards most of these things, because at the end of the day, the effects are usually very customized and individualized. It's very rare, I think, that these types of changes have have the same sweeping effect across all companies.
Stephanie, I wanted to ask you what you're pursuing and what your interests are.
So I'm actually pursuing the MD PhD at UAB, and my interests are in neurofibromatosis and the malignant peripheral nerve sheath tumors that arise in these patients. In particular, I look at the growth factor signaling as well as the cytogenomics of these tumors in the hopes of developing new chemotherapeutics where there have been previously none for these patients.
And so how did you get interested in that line of research?
as an undergraduate, I actually was fortunate enough to shadow in the laboratory of David Gutman, who is a preeminent researcher in neurofibromatosis and sees a number of these patients in clinic. And he was the one that introduced me to the disease and to the laboratory for which I pursued my PhD in. And it's been a very fruitful endeavor for me, both seeing these patients in clinic and understanding some of the pitfalls and problems that they face on a daily basis, as well as being able to go and do the research and make some progress. Actually, one of the interesting things that's arisen from some of the things that you were talking about in terms of increased regulation has been that there's a number of off-target uses for drugs, especially in cancer biology, that has come about because of some of the effects. These drugs are often not highly specific, and therefore we've been able to use drugs that are pre-approved by the FDA and therefore can be pushed faster through clinical trials to be able to help patients who previously have had no treatments.
Can you give me an example of one of those drugs?
So, for example, some of our research, which was just published, we've been using the estrogen receptor antagonist tamoxifen. And what we found is that in malignant peripheral nerve sheath tumors, although they do express the estrogen receptor, that this drug is actually able to kill the cancer cells in an estrogen receptor independent manner. And so it is an off-target effect rather than the initial direct effect of the tamoxifen that is killing the cancer cells.
Have you, now you're obviously seeing patients, so where are you in the process? How long is the process of doing an MD PhD? Is it 6, 7 years?
So on average right now, the national average sits at about 7.5 to 8 years. I'm currently starting my 7th year at University of Alabama, and I'm finishing my 4th year of medical school, so I'm beginning the application process for residencies at this point.
All right, so you're in rotations now then.
So yes, I just finished up my clinical rotations in May, and I'm on my electives and sub-internships right now.
Huh. Aimee, what as you look at all of the the different possibilities and paths that people can take, what are some of the more interesting things that you've seen? And if you give one piece of advice to the people who come into your office and say, I really want to pursue an MD PhD, is there one thing that you say, okay, this is what I've learned and this is what you should know?
Yeah, I think that the panel is really great in that it highlights the diversity of physician scientist training and where physician scientists can ultimately end up. And I'll just start by some outcome data. We looked at some of the outcomes of our graduates, which is very similar to the national outcomes of MSTPs and MD PhD programs across the country. And roughly almost half of them end up in academics, and then a good portion of them end up in other sectors, including industry, government such as CDC, FDA, private research institutions, etc. And so I think it really does highlight that with this training you can do a variety of different career paths that all contribute to the advancement of biomedical health in the United States, which is great. It's interesting in terms of how MD PhD training has changed or not changed, or what the best piece of advice is. I do think that one of the challenges that that's perhaps faced right now is that medicine is turning to big data, that there are a lot of really large interdisciplinary research teams, a lot of which are very translational. And so what I usually recommend to MD PhD students who are pursuing research, and it sounds like all of our MD PhD students right now are doing an amazing job, is to really go into a field and gain expertise in a very specific topic. Nowadays you can buy almost everything. Like you can make a knockout mouse with a company, you can have the microarray done with another company. So I always tell our MD PhD students, make sure that you get a definable skill. That is something that will be recruitable, that other people will need on that team, that you will be seen as the expert in that particular field, as opposed to being a data manager, which is actually relatively easy to do, in terms of pushing this data there, bringing that reagent here, but not actually, gaining the expertise yourself.
Well, that's so that's kind of laboratory expertise, but the kinds of things that say Frank David is doing. Those things are more about management, more about leading teams. Is there an emphasis on team leading in any of these programs?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you get them in different ways throughout training. For example, Penn's medical school is very team-oriented, team-based. So almost all learning is done in teams, really recognizing that all medicine is really executed through teams these days in regard to clinical care, in regard to everyday management of patients. And so I think they learn those skills a lot of times in that setting. Now, in terms of translating that into the research field, I mean, I think that from a practical standpoint, almost all research is collaborative in some way, shape, or form, and so they do pick it up on the job in that regard. I mean, I think that what we always say is, to again pick up the basic skills and be adaptable. We don't want to train people for how science is done now. We actually want to try to train people for how science is going to be done in 10, 15 years, which is when all of you will become PIs of your own. So that's what we're aiming for.
Well, let me ask Dan DelloStritto the last question. Dan, the work that you're doing now, as Aimee was talking about, looking ahead 10 years, what are the things that you wish that you had now that you hope will be developed by the time you're a principal investigator? Are there tools or approaches that you wish you could do? Do you wish that you had better access to big data or better tools to manipulate that data? Anything in that order?
So I think that that's very institution specific and kind of what your research interests are. So my research interest does not so much revolve around big data, but it's traditional molecular biology, cell culture, and in vivo studies, because that's the research interest of my core group here. However, I do agree that the future of medicine and translational medicine is big data. So I think that all physician scientists really should have some exposure to that, at least understand what it was. I remember the first time I was exposed to it about 2 or 3 years ago. I had no idea what it was, and then I dove into different things. So using EDX online courses to learn how to process larger data sets, and I think that each person has the capabilities of doing that with all the different resources that are out there now. It just takes that individual to go that extra step and make sure that they have what their tools in their toolbox for the future. Because we don't know what's going to happen with big data in 10 years. Right now, big data is the big thing. No pun intended, but 5 years ago, big data was just starting to emerge. And I think the other interesting technology that we'll see is CRISPR. I think in the last 3-4 years, CRISPR has really starting to take off and has some potential implications. And I think everyone in the physician scientist field should be aware of what it is and how that technology applies or could apply to their research interests.
Well, I think 3, 4, 5 years ago, almost nobody knew what big data was, and now there's Hadoop and everything else all around it. I want to congratulate all of you and wish you all well. And I want to advise the listeners and watchers of this to get active in these discussions. If you've been watching this so far, you're probably a good candidate for APSA membership. And is APSA membership free, Dan?
APSA membership it requires a little bit of a fee each year, or you can buy a group membership for all 8 years. We have different levels of membership. But I would if you're listening to this, I would advocate that you actually apply to our leadership team, our executive council. We do a lot of great things, and we're continuing to look for great leaders and those that are willing to put their volunteer work together to make APSA and the whole physician scientist community a better place.
I would just admonish people, when you Google APSA, you're going to probably come up with the American Political Science Association. That's not the one you want to join.
It's the third one down.
That one
Third
is
one down.
of party hacks. This one is the good one. This is the one with the sound of tinkling test tubes. So the American Physician Scientists Association is maybe the better Google string to look for. Thank you again, and good luck to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.